Generation X is often described as cynical, emotionally reserved, independent, and skeptical of authority. They're seen as the generation that doesn't complain much, doesn't ask for help easily, and prefers to quietly handle things on their own. But these traits didn't appear randomly. They were shaped. To understand Generation X, you have to understand the psychological environment they grew up in. Because Gen X was not raised in a time of emotional reassurance or long-term stability. They were raised during transition, uncertainty, and institutional decline. Generation X grew up watching systems lose credibility in real time. Governments failed publicly. Corporations stopped offering lifetime security. Divorce rates rose sharply. Families fragmented. And for many Gen X children, emotional consistency was replaced with emotional absence. This created a powerful psychological adaptation. Self-reliance became survival. Many Gen X kids were latchkey children. They came home to empty houses. They learned early not to expect constant supervision, emotional validation, or guidance. On the surface, this produced independence. But psychologically, it taught something deeper, that needing others was unreliable. When a child repeatedly experiences absence instead of support, the brain adapts. Emotional self-containment becomes safer than emotional expression. Over time, this becomes identity. Feelings are managed privately. Problems are solved internally. Vulnerability is minimized. This is one reason Generation X often struggles with emotional openness, not because they lack emotional depth, but because they learned early that emotions were something to control, not share. Another defining psychological force was uncertainty. Gen X grew up during economic instability, the Cold War, corporate downsizing, and rapid technological change. The future did not feel guaranteed. And when the future feels unstable, optimism becomes risky. Psychologically, Gen X learned to lower expectations as a form of self-protection. If you don't expect too much, you can't be deeply disappointed. This is where their reputation for cynicism comes from. But cynicism in this context is not negativity, it's emotional armor. This also explains their relationship with authority. Generation X watched leaders fail repeatedly. Promises were made and broken. Systems that were supposed to protect people often didn't. As a result, belief in institutions weakened. Instead of trusting systems, Gen X learned to trust themselves. This is why they tend to value competence over credentials, experience over titles, and action over words. Respect is earned through reliability, not position. Authority is tolerated only when it proves itself. Another important psychological trait of Generation X is emotional restraint. They were raised in a cultural period that did not prioritize emotional education. Mental health was not openly discussed. Vulnerability was not rewarded. Strength was defined as endurance. So Gen X learned to cope quietly. This created resilience, but it also created internal pressure. Many Gen X individuals carry stress without externalizing it. They are less likely to talk about burnout, anxiety, or emotional exhaustion, not because they don't experience it, but because they were conditioned not to display it. This is one reason Generation X is often misunderstood by younger generations. Millennials and Gen Z grew up with emotional language, validation culture, and mental health awareness. To them, Gen X can seem emotionally distant or dismissive. To Gen X, younger generations can seem fragile or overly expressive. Neither perspective is wrong. They were shaped by different psychological environments. One learned to adapt quietly, the other learned to express openly. Another overlooked aspect of Generation X psychology is invisibility. Gen X grew up between two generations that dominated cultural attention. Baby boomers controlled leadership and institutions. Millennials dominated media narratives. Gen X quietly carried responsibility in between. Psychologically, this reinforced a pattern of self-containment. Don't expect recognition. Don't rely on praise. Just do what needs to be done. Identity became rooted in function rather than expression. This is why many Gen X individuals derive self-worth from usefulness. Being competent feels safer than being seen. Being reliable feels more valuable than being admired. But this adaptation has long-term consequences. As Generation X ages, many experience a subtle internal conflict. They are capable, resilient, and independent, yet often disconnected from their emotional needs. They were taught how to survive, but not how to process. This becomes especially visible during midlife. Children grow up, careers stabilize or plateau, external pressure decreases, and suddenly, the internal world becomes louder. Questions arise that were never given space before. Who am I without my role? What actually fulfills me? What do I need emotionally? For a generation trained to suppress introspection in favor of responsibility, these questions can feel destabilizing. Another psychological layer is how Gen X relates to authenticity. Because they grew up skeptical of marketing, institutions, and authority, they tend to distrust performative identity. They are wary of self-branding, exaggerated emotion, and public vulnerability. To them, authenticity is quiet, private, proved through consistency, not display. This is why Gen X often resists modern identity culture, not because they lack identity, but because their identity was formed in an era where showing less was safer than showing more. None of this means Generation X is emotionally broken. It means they were optimized for a different world, a world where adaptability mattered more than expression, where independence mattered more than reassurance, where emotional armor was more useful than emotional openness. Yet a quiet shift is happening within Generation X right now. As the world becomes louder, faster, and more emotionally expressive, many Gen X individuals are beginning to reassess the armor they once needed to survive. What once protected them can later in life become isolating. Some are discovering that strength does not disappear when it is shared, that independence does not vanish when support is accepted, and that emotional awareness is not a weakness, but an expansion of the resilience they already possess. For Generation X, growth is not about becoming someone new. It's about allowing themselves access to parts of their inner world that were never given permission before. The same generation that mastered survival is now being invited into something different. Understanding this psychology is not about criticism. It's about context. Every generation adapts to what it must survive, and those adaptations become personality. Generation X adapted to instability, absence, and broken trust. And in doing so, they became quietly strong, emotionally guarded, and deeply self-reliant. If this video helped you understand the deeper psychological forces that shape generations, identity, and behavior, consider subscribing to our channel. In future videos, we'll explore the hidden psychology behind different generations, belief systems, and the mental frameworks that quietly guide how people think and live. I'll see you there.